All right, let's get started. Thank you again for coming this evening. What I'm going to be doing is presenting my talk that I gave at the last European Rotorcraft Forum, entitled "Understanding the Aerodynamics of eVTOL Outwash." And in that vein, first of all, giving a little bit of background to the material that I'll present. So let's start off from the basic premise, and that is that helicopters, tilt rotors, and many eVTOL aircraft rely on a set of propulsors to create lift during their descent and landing. And of course, as we know, this lift is created by accelerating air downwards through the propulsors. And this pattern of downwards moving air below the vehicle we call the downwash field. And I'm not going to talk about the downwash field in much detail tonight at all. Rather, what I'm going to talk about is what happens when that air comes in contact with the ground. What happens then is that the air in the downwash field is deflected radially outwards to form what we call the outwash field. And this video over here is a very nice visualization of just what happens when the flow in the downwash from this particular helicopter hits the ground and spreads laterally outwards. We're getting some nice free flow visualization in that particular instance. So you can see the air coming down, hitting the ground, spreading out laterally. And we're really interested in what the physics is within that lateral spreading out part of the flow happens to be. Now, let's first go back a few stages. It's probably very worthwhile giving some background to the work that I'll present a little bit later. And this is all about eVTOL aircraft, which of course were envisioned as an environmentally friendly and efficient method of transport within urban areas. Now, in operating in this fashion, these aircraft will require a network of landing sites, vertiports if you like, and these might need to be located in rather awkward positions within the existing city fabric. It's not likely that there are going to be barren areas which can just immediately be converted into operational sites for these particular aircraft. So this particular diagram over here, this picture from Embraer, illustrates that rather well. Where are we actually going to site these landing sites, these vertiports, within this complex and dense urban jungle that we can see in that particular picture? So regulators, and I'll single out the EASA regulators here, the European Aviation Regulation Authorities, are trying to address the problem of defining suitable flight corridors and approach paths to enable this form of intra-urban transport. And the intent of defining these flight corridors and approach paths is essentially to try to keep passengers and bystanders safe, and of course to then reduce the environmental impact of these aircraft, for example, the noise that they create within the urban setting. Now, if you go back to March 2022, EASA released a very interesting document with a very long technical name. It's normally just known as PTS VPT DSN, rolls off the tongue a lot more easily. And this gives an illustrative proposal of how they intended to define vertiports and their access routes within the urban jungle. So this is a picture, you might recognize it as Cologne's main railway station. And this diagram tries to illustrate how a vertiport might be stuck in amongst all these buildings on this little plaza, if you like, which is just outside the station. Now, the way that this particular system was supposed to work is that aircraft, in approaching the landing site over there, would be constrained, first of all, to approach above these planes over here. But by the time they got to just above the landing site, they would descend into this funnel-shaped object there, be constrained within that funnel-shaped object during the last few moments of their descent into landing. Now, coincidentally, I just presented a paper a few months earlier at the European Rotorcraft Inventor Tour in September 2022. And I got the chance then to present this work again. It was all about vortex ring state in the context of these new EASA proposals. And I did that at the Rotorcraft and eVTOL Safety Symposium, November 22 in Cologne in Germany. And you can have a look at that presentation, if you like, on YouTube, where it's there in all its glory. Now, what I did in that presentation is I showed that aircraft, in descending into this funnel-shaped final descent zone, would render themselves very susceptible to a particular instability of the rotors, of the rotor wakes, in fact, known as the vortex ring state, which is not something that you would want to do with eVTOL or even conventional helicopters. And the idea behind that was something fairly geometric. It was a fairly simple argument that I made. in that if you actually defined these approach surfaces and this final funnel in terms of their actual geometric properties, then you could quite easily map out some trajectories that the aircraft would have to follow in entering that last funnel-shaped part of the flight envelope. Now, you can see from this diagram that if you were to just graze the approach surface and then end up actually landing within there, under the most benign conditions, the shallowest allowable trajectory could be defined by this angle beta over here. If you were to come in any more shallowly, you would end up poking out the other side of the final funnel. Now, of course, any normal descent trajectory wouldn't be so constrained. You would have to come in along some trajectory like this and then enter in at a steeper angle to eventually reach the landing site. Now, if you take that geometry and you map it across to this diagram, which some of you will be familiar with, it's the standard diagram which shows that part of the flight envelope which is subject to vortex ring state. On the horizontal axis, I have, let me see if I can get a better pointer. On the horizontal axis, I have the forward speed of the aircraft, and on the vertical axis, I have the rate of descent. And vortex ring state is encountered over a range of forward speeds and rates of descent as shown by this red kidney-shaped lobe. Now, let's map a descent trajectory onto that particular diagram. And let's expand out this little part of the envelope over there into this diagram over here. Here's the boundary that I need to avoid if I'm to avoid vortex ring state during descent. So that's a viable descent trajectory. But now this angle over here, this dotted line over here, is the same as this angle beta over here, and that marks the shallowest descent into that particular cone-shaped object that's geometrically possible. Any viable trajectory actually lies to the left of that particular line, as shown over here by this solid blue line over there. Now you can see that what's happening is by enforcing a very steep descent into that final cone, you're actually forcing the aircraft to have to consider the possibility that vortex ring state might occur within the system. If I was to approach along that line at any descent rate greater than this point over here, then I would encounter vortex ring state. So in other words, the presence of the vortex ring state denotes the maximum descent rate that I can be traveling at the moment that I start this final descent into the landing site. Okay, so the lesson from that is you need to approach the landing site very, very slowly if you're going to avoid entering vortex ring state, or you have to come in very shallowly, which is not possible with this particular geometry of landing configuration. Okay, now what happens then if I start to consider outwash? Well, if I'm very low and very slow, just above the ground, then in this part of the domain over here, there's going to be very strong ground interaction. What that means in principle is that outwash from the vehicle could begin to be a problem. So in other words, faulty design of vertiports, according to this sort of geometrical argument, could lead to a coupling between the vortex ring state problem and, of course, the outwash problem. Now, this is the vortex ring state problem in a nutshell. What I've done here is I've taken a set of helicopters and a set of tilt rotor vehicles and a set of eVTOL aircrafts, and I've tried to compare them by plotting the log of their weight against their disk loading. Now, the disk loading is simply the weight of the aircraft, or the thrust that they're required to produce, divided through by the density and the area of all the rotors taken together. And if you plot this diagram for various typical vehicles, you end up with a situation where you can see that if my conventional helicopters all lie down here, and they tend to lie in a very well-defined curve, then the eVTOL aircraft that are currently about tend to scatter themselves with a very much higher disk loading for a given weight than conventional helicopters. Now, if I map that across to this vortex ring state lobe, then the size of the vortex ring state lobe in terms of real values over here, vertical speed in feet per minute and forward speed in knots, that the size of that lobe scales directly with the disk loading on the system. So what that means is that a conventional helicopter with a fairly low disk loading will have a vortex ring state lobe, which is this blue one over here, whereas the typical eVTOL with a much higher disk loading will have a much bigger part of the flight domain influenced by the vortex ring state. Now, the argument's not quite that simple, because at the same time as this vortex ring state lobe increases in size, it also moves downwards. So eVTOL aircraft actually have a slightly bigger margin in terms of their behavior right down at these low and slow parts of the flight trajectory, whereas helicopters tend to be better when you're sitting out at in the approach. And that's where eVTOL aircraft tend to run into a bit of a problem. Okay, so that's the VRS problem. How does that transcribe into the Outwash problem? Well, we need to transform the data because things are not quite as straightforward. You often read in the literature that eVTOL Outwash is a direct function of the disk loading, and that's not entirely true. There's a scale factor. There's a bit of the weight of the aircraft and the size of the aircraft actually enters into that argument as well. So this is my diagram of downwash velocity or disk loading versus log weight for the VRS case. If I transform that simply by plotting log weight versus log of disk area, then my disk loading or my downwash turns out to be constant along these diagonal lines over here. And you can see that the vehicle is actually split into 3 different classes. These guys down here are very small, potentially with very high disk loading and hence downwash velocities, but they are not potentially very likely to be very risky as far as the outwash characteristics is concerned. It's really these folk over here, which have roughly the same sort of weight as a conventional helicopter, but a much higher disk loading, that tend to be problematic, or that we think are going to be problematic with regards outwash. Okay, so just to recap, the outwash problem. Essentially, the outwash out across the ground is proportional to the disk loading of the vehicle, but the actual values of the outwash are that velocity multiplied by a scaling factor, which is dependent on the vehicle configuration. Well, that was the postulate that we started off with. Now, therein entered the UK CAA. They tendered for a contract, which we won in open competition in January 2023. And based on some of the technology that we could bring to the table in terms of our approach to modeling rotorcraft flows and our previous experience in various relevant domains, including strong ground effect and brownout. And I should remark at this stage that this was the beginnings of a very fruitful collaboration with Dr. Mike Price, and that continues to this day. And I'm very glad that we have Mike on the call this evening with us as well. Okay, so what did the CAA approach entail? Well, what we wanted to do is we wanted to adopt a systematic approach to understanding how the configuration of these various aircraft influenced the outwash character, or the character of the outwash that they produced. So we adopted a taxonomy of generic eVTOL aircraft. These weren't models of any specific aircraft, not a Joby or an Archer or an EHang or whatever it was. We actually abstracted the aircraft into their aerodynamic fundamentals. And those abstracted aircraft respected the relevant aerodynamic scaling laws and allowed a direct and fair comparison of their outwash characteristics. So they all had the same propeller designs, they all had the same thrust coefficient and so on, so that we could actually compare the outwash characteristics of each of these different aircraft. And we modeled a whole bunch of these using the computational approach that we've developed here at Sofrodyne. So in terms of this taxonomy, we could start with a conventional helicopter with a conventional disk loading. We could then go to a helicopter with a higher disk loading than conventional, and then we could branch off down all these interesting avenues. So we could look at tandem helicopters, we could look at tilt rotors and tilt wings, we could look at quad, octo, and multicopters, and we could look at something which at this stage we called lift cruise, but that technology has become a little outdated right now. And then we could look at these multi-thruster vehicles. This was a sort of Lilium in reverse, or a lift jet, which was perhaps a slight advance on that particular technology. Now, some of the key results from that particular study were, first of all, that aircraft with different configurations would produce very different outwash patterns. So just for comparison, 2 different aircraft here. This is an aircraft with 8 rotors arranged in planar fashion, 4 on either side of a central wing. And this is a lift jet with 4 lifting devices, which produced a jet-like flow out towards the ground, mounted behind the wings. And if we look at these plots, what essentially this does is the blue is the average velocity as a function of azimuth around the aircraft. The shading denotes the root mean square, and the red denotes the maximum velocities that we measured as a function of azimuth around the aircraft. And you can see, for example, that this particular square configuration, if you like, produces a very different pattern of outwash to the lift jet, where you can see that the flow here is concentrated essentially along 3 different axes in that particular case, whereas here we have multiple axes along which the outwash is particularly strong. The second key result is that the most unsteady parts of the velocity field are actually associated with powerful jet-like flows. Now, here's a visualization of one of the early XB-15s hovering above the water, and you can see these jet-like flows, this concentration of velocity, if you like, along the center line of the aircraft. Now, these kinds of configurations turned out to have similar characteristics, although a lot more complex. And if you have a look at these 3 configurations, you can see that they're actually quite similar. This is the rectangular 8-rotor vehicle. This is a configuration where I've moved one of the rotors outwards towards the tip, and this is the same configuration as the previous, but where I've moved one of the rotors somewhat backwards. And you might think that the outwash characteristics of those 3 vehicles might be quite similar, but in fact, they're very, very different. By making these small changes to the geometry, essentially what you can do is you can reorient the locations of these jet-like outwash flows quite significantly, and hence modify the characteristics of the outwash from the system. Now, the point that we realized is, first of all, that these intense flows are actually small enough and localized enough that they might slip through a coarse sensor net. And hence we had to be very, very careful in making recommendations in terms of how our real life friends would actually go about measuring the outwash from these particular vehicles. And secondly, that the flow in much of the outwash is actually unsteady enough to be misrepresented in strength by a sluggish sensor array. If your frequency bandwidth of your sensor array was not high enough, then it might miss some of these velocity components altogether. So 2 publications came out of that. The first one was an ERF paper in September 2023, where we made some recommendations for how test campaigns should be conducted in real life, taking into account these various theoretical numerical aspects of the outwash that we'd encountered during the CAA study. The second report was the main detailed report on the study itself, the detailed physical analysis. And that came out in October 2023 as CAA CAP 2576, which you can find either on the company website or on the CAA website itself. Now, work was going on elsewhere, of course. In May 2024, Joby presented a paper at the Vertical Flight Society Forum, where they used statistical processing of data to suggest that the outwash from their aircraft was actually much more benign than we'd predicted. On the other hand, the FAA produced a downwash survey, a rather notorious report these days, in December 2024, with results that suggested very high velocities in the outwash below 4 different eVTOL aircraft, one of which actually turned out to be the Joby S4 in any case. So that report was taken rather badly by the press, if you like. So, for example, an article in Flight Global in January 2025 suggested that the FAA study reveals hurricane force levels of eVTOL downwash and outwash, and hence a not very favorable outcome for the industry, and a fair amount of controversy was stirred up around that particular report. I think Elan Head, in her usual style, managed to capture the feeling of the times quite well in her Air Current article in February 2025, where she said, although both papers cite Brown's research, neither takes his advice to heart. And I quite enjoyed that, because essentially both of these reports had not actually, it seems, taken our warnings as far as sensor fidelity or layout is concerned. They hadn't taken those warnings to heart. Now, just when we thought we were making progress, the FAA was starting to pay significant attention to the outwash problem. As of mid-2025, the FAA regulatory agenda and the fundamental research at NASA has unfortunately been suspended. And the outwash issue has effectively been placed back in the hands of the OEMs, which for many reasons, I don't think is a great idea. I think the regulators should actually be leading this particular research, and hopefully we'll see some changes in that respect in short order. But of course, the world doesn't stand still. Things happen in other parts of the world. And if we go back a little bit, there was a very serious accident in March 2022, where a large helicopter coming into a hospital vertiport at the Derriford Hospital down in the south of England, it was a Sikorsky S-92, happened to be involved in an incident where an aged lady was blown over in the car park and later died as a result of her injuries. And the accident was attributed to downwash-related fluid dynamics. Now, the accident was in March 2022. The AIIB released its report in November 2023, and the coroner inquest report came out in December 2024, which required a response from the Department for Transport. That was the motivation, if you like, for a second CAA project, which was started in July 2024, where the basic premise was, okay, we'd spent a lot of time discussing and trying to understand the outwash below eVTOL aircraft, but perhaps we didn't understand the outwash particularly well that was created by conventional helicopters either. So we decided to go and have a little bit of a peek in detailed terms as to what was actually going on within the outwash of conventional helicopters. Now, it turned out very quickly that when you go into the safety community actually relies on a very simplistic view of the flow out below a hovering helicopter. So what they envisage is that the flow out below the helicopter descends down as a sort of jet-like flow, which on hitting the ground turns outwards and just carries on as a jet. Now, the basic fluid mechanics suggests that that's quite wrong, and I'll go into the reasons for that a little bit later. But if you go into the various publications which the industry relies upon, then you'll see various misrepresentations of the outwash characteristics below a hovering helicopter. This is a very influential publication in the British world, which was produced by BP, where they try to illustrate the dangers posed by the outwash below a heavy helicopter, largely in the context of oil rigs and operations offshore. And essentially their view is the outwash is the steady stream of air out across the deck, into which various people can get into trouble if they immerse themselves in that particular steady stream. Now, what the CAA decided to do is to actually test that contention in the physical environment based on the unsteadiness of the simulations that we'd revealed in the simulations of eVTOL aircraft. So here you see the CAA test here, but there's Mike Price standing with his anemometer, measuring the outwash in the flow below a hovering S-92 helicopter. And you can see here that the outwash looks particularly benign. Until you change your position with respect to the helicopter, then all of a sudden you find yourself buffeted from all sides by a very strong outwash field generated by that particular helicopter. Now, our role in that particular investigation was to use computer modeling to replicate the real world. So the real world's, of course, S-92, hovering at a certain height above the ground. We had to try and replicate that particular situation as closely as we could within the computational world, and then see what we could produce as far as the flows below the helicopter were concerned. Now, this is a particular example of the kind of simulation that we conducted. So here's our hovering S-92 above an extensive ground plane, modeled fairly simply, flat and inviscid. And here we have computational Mike standing at a position in front of the helicopter with a rake over here where he can actually determine what the velocities are as a function of height above the ground. And if I play that video, you'll notice something very interesting. Okay, so remember that the conventional idea is this almost steady jet of outwash across the ground, perhaps intermittently interrupted by turbulent fluctuations, as in a conventional turbulent jet. And by watching this little rake, you can see that that's by no means the case. The velocity is extremely unsteady and varies considerably from instant to instant. So there, the flows are 20 knots down near the ground. In a second, a pulse of vorticity will come across here, and you'll suddenly find the velocity is going up to 30, a pulse there to 50 knots, and then back down again. On occasion, the flow will reverse and actually come from behind the virtual mic sitting there in the flow. There we go. There was a flow reversal for a short moment of time over there. So these simulations confirmed or corroborated what was observed in reality, that the outwash field is actually highly non-uniform and unsteady. And it's actually the buffety and unpredictable nature of the outwash that seems to cause the most upset to people standing in that outwash. And the way that Mike describes it in the eventual report that was produced is essentially that there's a cognitive overload on the individuals trying to maintain their balance when standing in the outwash. Okay, so the output of that particular study was another CAP in April 2025 called Predicting the Future, Trials and Simulations of Downwash and Outwash for Helicopters and Powered Lift Aircraft. And the idea behind that report was essentially, can we do better than this fairly simple measure against outwash, sticking up a simple sign which says caution helicopter outwash? What does that really mean in practice? First of all, can we understand the physiological response? Can we understand why Mike felt cognitively impaired while standing in that outwash and being buffeted from side to side? Secondly, could we use simulations, such as the ones that we had produced, to train operators, pilots, and passengers appropriately to be aware of just what might happen were they to be exposed to outwash, let's say when climbing into an eVTOL or a conventional helicopter? And thirdly, to make vertiport designers aware of the risks that they might be designing into their infrastructure by adopting certain measures. Overly constrained landing areas, facades that were too close to the aircraft operating areas, various barriers and impediments put into the flow. Okay, so the second cap was out in April 2025. Now let's skip ahead. Let's get to the meat of what I was hoping to talk about tonight, which was a paper that I presented at the 51st European Rotorcraft Forum 2025, a few weeks ago in Venice, in Italy. And Venice is truly as beautiful as this. It's perhaps a little bit less polished, a little bit more grubby, but if you haven't been there, then it's most definitely a place to visit. Now, the motivation behind the paper was essentially that we generated a tremendous amount of additional material during the CAA studies. And a lot of that additional material and insight hadn't actually made it into the final reports that we managed to produce. So the European Rotorcraft Forum gave us an opportunity to collate some of these findings into a fairly comprehensive paper. And if I say comprehensive, perhaps I should rather say dense. I think the paper is not a particularly easy read. We packed it full of information. You can go and read it again on the website, but hopefully this presentation will help to make its principal findings just a little bit clearer. And the basic premise of the paper was that understanding rotorcraft outwash requires us to come to terms with some very intricate and beautiful physics. And that was manifest within the simulations that we had conducted. And if we think that helicopters with their single rotors are complex, then eVTOLs with their multiple rotors are even more complex as far as their outwash is concerned. And indeed, if we dig away deeply into the physics, then it turns out that potentially a lot of what we thought we knew might need revision in the light of new experimental and numerical insights. This is an interesting topic that often emerges in physics, where sometimes your understanding is more conditioned by the way the lens at which you look through at the physics than what's actually there. And you change your lens and all of a sudden you see very different things and you realize that your understanding is incomplete. Okay, so the title of the paper, Understanding the Aerodynamics of eVTOL Outwash. And just to recap, in case this was a little bit too long ago, remember that the outwash is this turning laterally outwards of the flow below a helicopter or a rotorcraft when that wake below the rotors interacts with the ground and turns laterally outwards. Okay, so very clear, a nice visualization in that particular case, which allows us to see how the flow coming down from the rotor turns laterally outwards to form an outwash. Okay, now let's go back a step and enhance a little bit some of the explanations that I tried to give earlier. Now, what I asserted earlier is that the helicopter community's traditional view of the outwash is as a structured, axially symmetric stream of air out below the rotorcraft. So the air comes down in jet-like fashion, turns when it hits the ground, and spreads outwards in a radially symmetric jet. The flow in that jet is not necessarily constant, but we can define a mean velocity and a variation of that mean velocity with height that makes sense. And on top of that, we can then determine a maximum velocity, which also makes sense in some sort of fashion. Now, the whole idea of the flow outwards being a wall jet is actually wrong. It's not a jet at all. It's the consequences of the diversion of the wake. And there's a technical difference between wakes and jets, which will become apparent in a few minutes' time, hopefully. But stepping back, if we go to the computations and we run them for inordinate lengths of time, and we actually average out the flow on the ground below the vehicle, we do end up with this radially symmetric pattern of outwash. In other words, the flow is directed outwards in all directions, more or less equally from the helicopter, and the flow decreases in velocity from a maximum just around the tips of the rotors outwards, reaching very low levels the further outwards we tend to go from the vehicle. Now, that's only true if we average out the flows. And actually, it's a very obvious consequence of the fluid dynamics. You wouldn't expect anything else to take place, because if you start off with symmetrical boundary conditions, although you don't necessarily generate symmetrical solutions, if you average out over all possible solutions that are possible, those solutions should manifest the symmetry of the original boundary conditions. So if we've got an axially symmetrical rotor, we expect all the flow solutions when averaged together to give you an axially symmetric solution to that as well. Okay, now what happens is if we look at the unsteady nature of that flow, we see something very, very different. We see a lot more structure. We see these waves of velocity which travel outwards in a radial fashion, but the instantaneous velocities can vary quite considerably. And in fact, you can see that way away from the helicopter, the velocities can actually be quite high. All we're seeing here is that these high velocities way away from the helicopter tend to be quite infrequent compared to the number of times that we see high velocities near the center of the system. Okay, and that turns out to be really important. And the reason for this difference is that the flow is fundamentally vortex dominated. Now, what do I mean by that? I'll explain in a few slides' time. Now, let's try and extrapolate this idea of how the outwash behaves from a single rotor vehicle to a multiple rotor vehicle. And this is the encapsulation that was current up until fairly recently of the flow out in the outwash below a twin rotor vehicle, something like a tilt rotor, a V22. And the idea here is that simply we have two of the outwashes from a single rotor helicopter, if you like, juxtaposed side by side, and in the middle, somehow these flows meet and conform to the existence of the other rotor. So in this particular visualization, the flows collide in the middle and they turn upwards to give you this upwash sheet below the aircraft. But you can see the key feature of this particular diagram is that the flows from the two rotors don't mix. There's this dividing surface which keeps the flow from this rotor separate from the flow from that rotor. Now, it turns out that this particular idea is also only tenable if one is interested only in the mean velocities. You can see that you end up with a nicely defined mean, and that mean has the kind of lateral symmetries that you would expect from the lateral symmetry of the aircraft itself. But again, if you go to the unsteady case and you look at what the simulations give you, then that whole mean flow is very difficult to identify within the pattern of instantaneous flow that develops out across the ground. So you can see these bursts of velocity out in all different directions, these jets of flow in certain directions that you can pick up every now and again. And there's a much more structured and granular outwash than allowed for by the old wall jet conceptualization. And certainly you can see that these upwash sheets, these partitions between the wakes of the various rotors just don't seem to exist in these simulations. The flows from the different rotors can intermix and interpose, and in fact the flow from one rotor can take over a certain domain in space from the rotor flow generated by the flow generated by another rotor, and then things can switch over again, and it's a much more chaotic and complex situation than envisaged by the simple picture given over here. Now, why is this important? Well, what we measure and how we measure it becomes critical when assessing the safety of eVTOLs when exposed to the public. And understanding the spatial and temporal variation of the velocity in the outwash becomes critically important if you take the findings of CAP 3075 into account to understanding what the risks potentially posed by aircraft operating at low altitude above the ground in the presence of passengers and bystanders happens to be. Now, this is the Joby aircraft. There's the measurement rig that they used to measure the outwash from that particular aircraft. And you can see how it's very much informed by a very old style of thinking, in that the sensors are very, very sparsely applied at various locations around the aircraft. This is not the Joby aircraft, by the way, but you can see in this particular illustration that this sensor layout is hardly going to be sufficiently dense to be able to pick up an outwash field which has the complex characteristics that I'm trying to show over here. Secondly, you might need to worry that our old style information is not particularly well suited to the range of passengers that might be convinced to take a flight in one of these eVTOL aircraft. So what about children, aged people, and so on? What is their experience of the outwash, given this idea that the cognitive influence of being immersed in these unsteady flows might be very, very different depending on who you might happen to be? So the approach that we take to try to gain some insights into this problem is to model the flow. All these simulations that I've shown you so far have been modeled using a CFD method, which is derived from the incompressible Navier-Stokes equations. We don't write the there are two different ways of writing the Navier-Stokes equations for the purpose of computational simulations. The first is to write them in so-called velocity pressure formulation. That's the standard way of going about things. This is the Navier-Stokes equations written in velocity pressure formulation. The U is the velocity and the P is the pressure. Now, the problem with that particular approach is that you don't gain an appreciation of the innate structure of the flow, which is contained within the vorticity field. In fact, these methodologies don't often preserve the vorticity field. They misrepresent it in certain ways, and so that the flow structure is actually destroyed as the simulation progresses. The advantage of the vorticity velocity formulation of the Navier-Stokes equations, on the other hand, is that you go from this kind of meat-like representation of the flow to a bones-like representation of the flow. These are vortices which comprise the sort of innate structure of the flow. And if we can capture those and determine where those go, we can get a very good qualitative and quantitative idea of how the flow actually evolved. It's a somewhat unconventional approach, but it can be solved in a way that preserves the structure of the flow. Two important properties of the Navier-Stokes equations when expressed in vorticity velocity form and solved using our approach is that we can ensure that the flow remains incompressible, and we can ensure that the vorticity field itself remains divergence-free. Now, why the second condition is so important is because the idea that the vorticity consists of these loops that are interconnected and those interconnections cannot be broken implies a topological constraint on the vorticity field. It limits how the field can actually evolve. And if you lose that constraint within your numerics, then you start to predict spurious evolution of the vorticity field. So that's an important characteristic of the method. And I'll apply it in a second to in a slide, which is going to come about right now. Now, let's start simple in trying to understand the outwash below a rotor system. Let's start with a single rotor and have a look at what its wake structure looks like. So what I have here is a single rotor producing thrust in that direction. And in the process of producing that thrust, it produces a wake below itself. And the wake consists primarily of these very strong tip vortices and then some additional structure which lies inboard of those tip vortices. And these tip vortices propel themselves down into the flow below the system. And in so doing, essentially, they duct the flow down towards the ground, where if the ground plane is eventually present, that flow can spread outwards as the outwash. Now, it so turns out that these tip vortices are inherently unstable to small perturbations. So if I change the position of them ever so slightly, they undergo an unstable evolution. And of course, these perturbations are always present. They're little bits of vorticity floating around in the flow field as a result of atmospheric turbulence, and there's noise and all sorts of things which tend to cause these perturbations. Now, there are two basic modes of instability within the helicopter rotor wake. The first is a mode which is called the leapfrog mode. And what that does is it causes these individual loops of vorticity from the blades to actually exchange position as they move downwards into the flow. And here you can see one of these positional exchanges having just taken place. So this vortex over here actually belongs below the one that's over here. But because of this instability, they've exchanged position. Now, if you've got individual vortex loops, then those vortex loops can quite happily exchange position and carry on their merry way down into the flow. But because those are not individual vortex loops, they're actually connected into a helical structure, that imposes a topological constraint. Instead of exchanging properly, they tangle. And at the process of tangling, the vorticity actually has to turn up on its end. You can see what's going on here. These vortices are no longer nicely aligned with the rotor plane, but they're starting to tilt upwards to eventually be aligned with the axis of the rotor itself. So this realignment and tangling is a real problem in the rotor wakes. What it does is it actually enhances the decay of the system through another instability mode, which is known as the short wavelength mode. This mode destroys the coherence within the rotor wake and creates this finer scale mush of structure, which eventually emerges in the far wake of the system. Now, the interesting thing to realize is that this is a so-called convective instability within the system. So at the same time that these instabilities are growing in spatial extent, those instabilities are also being swept downstream into the flow below the rotor. So where that instability point lies is dependent on just how much thrust is being produced by the rotor, and also the rate at which those instabilities grow is proportional to the thrust produced by the rotor. So we end up with this kind of equilibrium where no matter what the thrust produced by the rotor, the wake does tend to break down at a certain distance below the rotor system, measured in terms of rotor radii. And that doesn't change for different rotors very much, or is dependent on how much thrust the rotor is actually generating. Now, what that particular analysis solves is an interesting question, and that is just how far downstream of the rotor does the downwash extend? And it turns out that the downwash scaling is solely dependent on the size of the rotors of the system. So that's where eVTOL aircraft actually win out over large aircraft. Their downwash doesn't tend to extend below the aircraft as far as it does for conventional bigger rotors with their bigger, sorry, helicopters with their bigger rotors. But more detail of that is in the paper. It's a bit of a digression to pursue that too far in present context. Okay, so if you accept this instability model, then perhaps we can derive a very simple model for what the wake actually does. We can see the wake as it progresses downwards below the system, changing or transitioning through a series of states as it propagates towards the ground. So at the top over here, we have a coherent wake where the vortex loops are clearly distinguishable. But as we go further down into the wake, those vortex loops are destabilized, disorders, and eventually we end up with a turbulent structure way down in the wake below the system. So a descent from coherence to chaos, if you like, a way of remembering what's going on there. Now, when we put the ground in the way, then the system changes. So here I've stuck in the ground, and depending where the ground is placed with respect to this cascade from coherence to disorder, we might expect to see very different structures in the outwash. So at a high hover, we might expect a turbulent ground interaction, but then as we move closer and closer to the ground, that turbulent ground interaction can change into something quite structured. So for the lowest altitudes of hover above the ground, we might see actually a very coherent set of vortex waves traveling out across the ground, which then decays with distance away from the system into a turbulent and disordered system way away from the rotor system. So that's the first step in terms of a sort of semi-qualitative, semi-quantitative understanding of what goes on in the wake below a hovering rotor in strong ground effect. In other words, in trying to understand the outwash below a conventional rotor. So we might want to supplant that model over there with something which is a little bit more complex, where you can see these domains in which the wake out across the ground or the outwash might have very different characteristics. Now, it looks appealing. It's a nice diagram. Took me ages to do in PowerPoint, but it doesn't actually fit all the facts. Have a look here. We've actually possibly oversimplified things. So here's a simulation of the S92 in a high hover above the ground. Now, if you believed everything that I told you up to now, what you'd expect is to see a completely symmetric stream of flow down towards the ground, which would then spread out across the ground, and you perhaps see all these concentric vortex waves. But in certain cases, you don't see that at all. Look what's going on here. The flow actually meanders from side to side below the rotor system. So at one point, the flow is jetting out along this direction, then it becomes a little bit more symmetrical again, and then a little while later, you'll see it'll start to jet out along a different direction. And what we're seeing here is something that's quite well understood in the physics community. It's an example of something called symmetry breaking. And the way to think about this is that the solutions to the fluid dynamic equations can actually have less symmetry than might be expected from the boundary conditions. So just because we've got an axially symmetric rotor doesn't mean that the fluid dynamic solutions that rotor will produce will all be similarly axially symmetric. But if we have solutions with less symmetry, then we'll also find other solutions alongside that original one with the broken symmetry. If we take all the possible solutions together, then if we average them out, we'll restore the system to have the same underlying symmetry as the original boundary conditions. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So in other words, we have a symmetrical set of boundary conditions, in this case, an axially symmetric rotor. It needn't generate axially symmetric wakes only. If it generates wakes which are not axially symmetric, on the other hand, we'll find a whole lot of other wake patterns which taken together are all axially symmetric. Okay, so here what we're seeing is this meandering mode which the wake can actually adopt. Now, the direction of that jet is actually erratic and unpredictable. Here we have a fairly axially symmetric solution out on the ground plane. Here the velocity turns off in one direction and jets out along that particular axis. A little while later, the flow's changed direction, is busy jetting out along that axis. Sometime later, if the simulation had gone on for long enough, I might find a flow which had jetted out along this direction as well. Now, the interesting thing here is that the velocities in these jets are considerably higher than the flow anywhere else. So that should cause us to worry a little bit if we have these symmetry broken, or these solutions with broken symmetry. Because if we don't know that the flow is intermittent, then we're likely to mischaracterize it. So if the jet comes and goes, then how do we actually quantify or qualify what's going on in that particular outwash situation? And this is a particular velocity sample that we might measure over the period of something like 80 seconds. So this is the radial velocity outwards at some particular position out in front of the helicopter as measured over a period of time. And you can see that the velocity doesn't really have a well-established mean, in that if I were to take the algebraic mean of all the velocities that I measure, I seldom have a flow which has actually got that mean velocity. The flow has a lot more structure. It ends up having these sort of this pulsatile character, where there are bursts of higher velocity interspersed with these quiescent periods. So a burst of high velocity, a quiescent period, another burst, more quiescent periods. And you can see that the typical period of flow intermittency is about 10 to 15 seconds. And if I look at the mean velocities, if I just sample over these bursts, then you can see that my radial velocity is around about 40 knots, whereas my mean velocity is as measured around about 20 and a bit knots. So how do we actually encapsulate the qualities of this outwash distribution in terms of proper statistics if we were to apply the old characterization of the flow? And certainly you can imagine that the physiological response to intermittent flows like this might be very different compared to when you're immersed in a more structured outflow. If you're sitting there braced against a flow which is more or less constant velocity, that's one thing. If you're immersed in a flow where the velocity suddenly comes in a burst and then stops and then comes in a burst erratically at some later time, you can imagine that the effect on the person immersed in that particular outwash is going to be very, very different. Okay, so much for single rotor systems. Let's have a look at multi-rotor systems and see if we can make a little bit of insight into that. Now, this is, if you like, a simple extension to the simple model that I introduced earlier, this one with these partitions between the flows generated by each of the individual rotors. So you might think that for a multi-rotor vehicle like this, that we might be able to partition the flow out on the ground plane into these independent regions where what we see in that particular sector of the flow is simply due to the aerodynamics of that particular rotor out there. And in fact, this model was quite heavily developed in the 1960s and 1970s and was applied in various jet lift systems with various measures of lack of success, unfortunately. So what this particular approach doesn't really acknowledge is, first of all, the observed unsteadiness of the flow at the interfaces and the amount of mixing and interaction that takes place between and within these different wake zones. And this is just a snapshot of the flow below one of these 8-rotor vehicles. And you can see just how complex and mixed up and unsteady the flow happens to be in the outwash below a vehicle like that, as predicted by our simulations. Now, why is the question we might ask? What's actually going on here? What makes the actual difference? So what we did is we had a look at a very simplified model. We cut out all the complexity, and we looked at a very, very simple situation consisting of just 2 circular vortex rings near a ground plane. So what these 2 vortex rings do is they represent some of the real bare bones physics and the symmetry of a 2-rotor system. And then what we do is we evolve the vorticity in those 2 vortex rings using the full equations of motion. But what we do is we do something a little bit sneaky. What we do is we perturb the structure of those vortices very slightly using a random perturbation to the direction of the vorticity in that particular loop. And we see what happens. Now, something really, really interesting happens depending on what symmetries we allow to remain within the particular flow, that particular flow situation. So if we ensure that this plane between the 2 rotors remains a plane of mirror symmetry, then what we notice is that no matter what randomly perturbed solution initial conditions we start off from, the flow more or less evolves along the same path. So sometime later, the flows look roughly the same. These vortices don't have distinctly different character to them after a certain amount of time has elapsed. On the other hand, if we don't enforce that plane of lateral symmetry between the 2 vortex rings and just allow the loops to advance from these initial conditions, we see radically different solutions to the flow depending on what those random initial perturbations happen to be. So the structure of this particular solution is not very well related to what we see over here. And this is because of the inherent instability of the vortex system. It can take these very small perturbations to the initial conditions, and it can amplify those over finite time to yield incredibly different solutions to the actual flows that you see. So really important here. Because of the inherent instability of the vortices, the solutions that you find can follow a markedly different evolution every time that you observe the system. Now, those perturbations are so small that you can't actually tell how the system has actually been perturbed. So in the full-scale system or in the rail system, because we don't know just what these little perturbations to the system might be, can we actually predict what the actual dynamics of those vortices are, and in other words, what the final state of the outwash within the system happens to be? So that's a question that was very much worth exploring, and we did in real contact. So just to summarize then, because it's so important, the symmetry breaking within the fluid and the inherent instability of the vortex dynamics, first of all, destroys the partitioning of the wakes into separate zones. You can see here that we're seeing the prototype of mixing between the left and right-hand zones taking place. It leads to essentially unpredictable and chaotic evolution of the wake, and in fact, it results in the structures that self-propel at high speed across the ground, and that we observed in our very first study as these outwards propagating high-speed jets of flow. Go and have a look at CAP 2576, where we talk about these in a lot more detail. Okay, this is a simple example though, right? It's just two vortex loops. What happens if we actually go to a full system where we have the full wake dynamics? So here's an example where it's a simple quadcopter type device. It's not quite as simplistic as it looks. The rear rotors are at a slightly higher elevation above the ground than the forward rotors. And what I've done is I've plotted the solution in terms of the vorticity distribution on the ground below that vehicle at different points during its evolution. So this is at a very early time when the flows have just got going, if you like. And you can see that what I'm looking at here are the individual starting structures generated by each of these rotors, and a certain amount of symmetry between the various rotors is still preserved. And you might even agree that these flows are actually partitioned into separate zones. There's not much mixing between the blue stuff, the blue vorticity, and the yellow vorticity or the red vorticity. As time goes on, that partitioning starts to break down. You can see some really, really interesting dynamics going on at the interfaces between these zones. So here you can see the yellow vorticity intertwining and wrapping up with the blue vorticity to create something very much more complex. And that progresses as time goes on. So here, even more complex structure, until once the flow has more or less fully developed, a lot of that starting structure has dissipated into something which is essentially unpredictable and chaotic. So you can see along the axis behind the aircraft here, there's a tremendous amount of mixing going on, and we might even characterize the flow in here as very much as turbulent. Out here, you can see the fairly smooth portions of the flow, but out along the forward axis of the vehicle, you can see this turbulent jet, or this highly structured jet busy extending out into the flow over there. So symmetry breaking is evident within the calculations that we produce, and we think that that's a fundamental mechanism of importance within the full-scale outwash. Now let me try to run that as a simulation for you so you can see it happening in practice. So this is one of these jet lift vehicles, 4 jets, all producing a flow out towards the ground, which spreads out across the ground as an outwash. And you can see how the flow starts off in a fairly structured fashion, if I rewound, but as time progresses, that structure is lost and the flow ends up taking on a much more chaotic form. And in fact, this jet that you can see coming out the front of the head tends to meander. In this particular instance, it's pointing out in that direction. If I ran the simulation for long enough, you'd see it would eventually curve over and start moving off in this direction over here. And by my previous argument, of course, you'd expect that because of the symmetry of solutions given the symmetry of the boundary conditions. Okay, so this idea of symmetry breaking and the destruction of symmetry within the flow and the creation of essentially unpredictable flow structure. Now, what that means is perhaps that our simple model of the outwash below multi-rotor vehicles needs to be enhanced a little as well. So in particular, the idea of rigid boundaries and wake sectors should be replaced with a much more dynamic representation of the outwash near the confluence of the wakes of the individual rotors. And I've tried to illustrate that in this particular situation over here. So in other words, there's our old model, perhaps enhanced in the way that I suggested earlier for a single rotor. But over here, we don't end up necessarily with these confluence planes. Things are a lot more chaotic. We can end up with upflows, but we also end up with this jetting and these evolving and chaotic flow structures in that particular part of the flow. Now, again, looks very nice, but it's not really the whole story. And this was a really, really curious simulation that we ended up doing. Now, the idea here was to try to actually make a constructive input into a proposed industry technique for measuring the outwash below an eVTOL aircraft. Now, of course, the problem with eVTOL aircraft is that they don't have infinite battery life, or infinite power supply, should we say. Their battery life is quite limited. So you want to do as many tests of the system in as short a possible time as you possibly can. Also, you probably don't have money to put enough sensors on the ground to satisfy theoreticians like me. You've probably only got 10 to 15 sensors to hand. So how do you actually place those sensors economically on the ground in order to encapsulate the outwash of the vehicle? And one potential technique is to use something called an azimuthal sweep, where you place the sensors out on the ground in a fairly simple pattern. And instead of moving the sensors or having a very dense sensor array, what you do is you move the aircraft with respect to the sensors. So you'll sit with the aircraft in that heading for an amount of time, take your readings, and then you'll move the aircraft onto a new heading, take a few readings, move the aircraft onto another heading, and take the next set of readings. Okay, it seems an inherently reasonable approach at face value. But of course, we know that the wake is convective in nature. This is one of the key aspects of their dynamics. So in other words, you change the position of the aircraft or any characteristic of it, and you need to wait for a finite amount of time for the wake to reestablish itself in its original pattern on the ground. Now, this numerical experiment was set up to reveal the time that needed to be left for the flow to settle between subsequent measurements. Okay, we expected quite a lot of time needed to be left in the order of the convection speed of these structures out across the ground. Another important issue, this convective instability that I mentioned, means that these disturbances can propagate back from the wake into the rotor system itself. And that really, really hurts this proposed technique by massively increasing the time required between subsequent tests of the system. But we thought, okay, we'll do the experiment and we'll quantify this particular time. So what we did is something very, very simple. And I tried to show this in this video. So we set up a twin rotor system. And we let it run in this particular configuration for a while, setting up the outwash across the ground. Once that outwash had been established, we flew the aircraft, yawed it effectively into a new orientation with respect to the ground plane. And then we waited for the flow to reestablish itself. And we monitored certain flow characteristics in order to be able to determine when the statistics of the flow had actually reestablished itself, so that the outwash, let's say, along that direction had statistically the same character as the outwash originally had along this direction over here with the rotors in their original location. Now, something really, really interesting happened. This was the flow that we measured with the rotors in that orientation. You can see highly chaotic, very mixed. Looks like some sort of cake mixer had taken hold of the flows in the wake, at least of the vortices in the wake. Highly complex flow with a velocity distribution which looks much the same left and right. So a left-right symmetry, and at least in a statistical sense. Then what we did is we rotated the system through that 90 degrees. I've taken out that 90 degrees rotation just to try to compare the flows before the rotation to the established flow after the rotation had taken place. So we'd expect the flow on this side of the system to look identical to the flow on that side of the system, and indeed the flows on both sides to be roughly equivalent to the flows that we saw in this early situation over here. But the interesting thing is that in moving the rotors into their original location, we broke the symmetry for one thing. So in this case, you can see that this flow still has that highly irregular cake mixer type style, but here the flow has gone into one of these smooth outwash patterns. There are not many vortex ripples over here. In fact, the flow is particularly quiescent and straightforward. And no matter how long we waited, and we waited for a long time. In computational terms, we ran for something like 1,000 rotor revolutions, which is an inordinate amount of computational effort to produce a result like this. And the flow did not return to its original state. We could not get the flow to reestablish itself in the rotated equivalent of this particular situation over here. Now, what that means, it seems, is that the state of the system might be very strongly tied to its history. So in other words, depending on how you start the system, you might measure something completely different to if you'd started the system from some different set of initial conditions. And that's brought home very much by these velocity traces conducted from the data, or constructed from the data at these two sensor locations over here. This is in the original flow, and you can see that at least qualitatively, that the flow at sensor 1 and sensor 2, as measured over a period of about 100 rotary revolutions over here, the flow is quantitatively very similar, and qualitatively, in fact, it has this sort of burst quiescence type of character to it. If I look at the flow after the system was rotated, and I'd left a lot of time for the flow to reestablish itself, on the other hand, you can see with the difference over here. The left-hand rotor remains in this burst quiescent kind of mode, whereas the sensor over here at location 2 registers something which is much more uniform in character. Okay, now this is really important, I think, when it comes to quantifying the outwash from these particular vehicles. How we conduct the experiment might lead us to very, very different conclusions as to what the outwash below these particular vehicles actually happens to be. And if we are only using 2 sensors, or actually throwing away that sensor, let's say, and only using a bunch of sensors out here, we need to be particularly careful that we're not contaminating the results by the fact that we're not measuring the system at enough points. Okay, so these results suggest that our understanding of the outwash, especially below multi-rotor aircraft, is still very incomplete, and certainly raises some very basic questions that challenge our understanding regarding the behavior of these sorts of systems. So let me try and bring this talk to its natural conclusion. Firstly, although many of the topics that I've talked about might seem very theoretical, they potentially have real-world consequences. A lot of the argument in the community up to now is focused around the minutiae of sensor placement, density, and frequency response. And of course, these are important issues, but we need to frame these issues within a fundamentally correct understanding of the physics of the system. So in other words, if we believe that the velocity field is radially symmetric and that the statistics are relatively stationary with time, then we're likely to reinforce those beliefs by adopting a sensor array that is consistent with that belief. This is the scientific idea of the lens through which you view the system, and changing that lens can change dramatically your understanding of just what's going on. Now, there's a lot of pressure from within the community to just do something, anything almost. But the arguments presented here will hopefully caution those folk out here who would like to just go and measure and see what we find, and then to try to apply those findings to understanding the outwash below these sorts of vehicles. We need to apply the scientific method, and we need to understand what we're trying to achieve before we go out and waste time and energy in actually observing the system in reality. So the results that I presented in this particular presentation hopefully will stir up a few questions in your mind, some of them very important, I think. So amongst those questions might be, will the outwash produced by an aircraft on startup be the same as that produced after landing? So in other words, how we operate the aircraft might have a significant influence on what the outwash generated by that aircraft might turn out to be. The history of the system, in other words, comes into play and governs the behavior of the system in a very strong and inherent fashion. The second thing we might ask is how reliable might be measured data obtained using the so-called industry standard methodologies, such as altitude ladders and azimuthal sweeps. If we don't apply these methods correctly, because there's some inherent flaw in the physics that underpins them, then the results that we're going to get are effectively useless in quantifying the behavior of these vehicles. And in fact, the biggest question that one could probably extract from the information that I've presented tonight is the question of whether an aircraft actually even has a unique outwash pattern. Is the outwash pattern so heavily influenced by how that aircraft is being used that on one day we might measure one thing, on the other day we might measure another? And of course, in the presence of atmospheric perturbations, slight winds, and so on, this idea of symmetry breaking takes on an even bigger role, which I'll talk about perhaps in a later presentation. Now, the thing I find fascinating about all this is that the more we study, the more that we seem to find that we don't know. And therein lies the challenge, if you like. How do we proceed on this basis? Well, first of all, we need to acknowledge that the modeling and simulation of outwash and the understanding of the outwash problem is perhaps one of the most complex ever addressed by the helicopter and rotorcraft community. It's one of the grand challenges, if you like. The behavior of the system, as I've shown, lies in this very sensitive middle ground between stability and instability. The flow is heavily driven by instabilities, and those instabilities are actually incredibly difficult to model using conventional numerical techniques, or to understand using specific experimental techniques, even those that might be set out to try to reveal the instabilities within the system. So what do we do? Well, I think we have a number of approaches open to us. The first of those is that we can carry on as usual. We can say that the problem's done and dusted, we've got methodologies that work, and we can go ahead and we can continue along our merry way, producing results, producing tons of papers, and treating this as a non-problem. The other approach, though, is using this particular scenario to rejuvenate our understanding of rotorcraft aerodynamics. And that's what I intend to do. So please follow along in future presentations, and we'll try to take you along on that journey. But I'll draw things to a conclusion here, and I'll thank you once again for coming along this evening. It's been a pleasure to have you. So good night and good luck from me, and we'll talk again soon.